Welcome to the second day after yesterday's opening of the conference Future of Code Politics 2, Technologies of Radical Care. For those who don't know me yet, I'm Şeyda and I'll be moderating through the sessions of today and tomorrow. And before we get started, I'd like to explain a few things for you in the audience and for our viewers in the stream. Hello again. So we very kindly ask you to wear your masks during the sessions to protect you and others and us. And at the entrance, there are also medical masks if you need one, or for later or tomorrow. So we have a translation into German spoken language here on site at Kampnagel, over there. There are two wonderful dolmetschers. And if you want to try out the translation into spoken German language, you can pick up your headphones at the entrance. And yeah, it's a blue channel. Unfortunately, there is no translation into German spoken language in the stream, but only subtitles. I will repeat it in German. So, falls ihr die die Verdolmetschung ausprobieren möchtet, hier auf Kampnagel könnt ihr euch Kopfhörer abholen am Eingang. Es ist der blaue Kanal. Im Stream haben wir leider keine Verdolmetschung in die deutsche Lautsprache, nur Untertitel. And for our viewers in the stream, if you need subtitles in English, German, Afan Oromo, or Luganda, please check the video descriptions at the bottom of the YouTube stream. There you will also find a link to the subtitle function. And don't be worried if it doesn't start directly. It takes about 20 seconds until the subtitles show up. And the subtitles in Miche will be unfortunately added a bit later. They will be available in the recording from August 29 at the latest. So, back to the program. So yesterday we already had an opening panel with the curatorial team highlighting the central themes and questions for the next few days. So what is technology? What do we understand as technology? What is care? What is radical care? What knowledge is dominant and which technologies, which softwares, which programs does it produce? And how are systems and technologies of oppression interconnected? What does Afrofuturist imaginations, childcare systems in the US, or indigenous ways of thinking about technologies, what do they have together, or what interconnects them, and how are globalized infrastructures of software and other technologies also interconnected, and what does have the German care crisis to do with it? And these questions will be discussed and expanded in the conference today and also tomorrow with a variety of artistic, discursive approaches, and today the very material and institutional conditions of technologies will be in the foreground. And in this context, also strategies will be discussed, and also the question, with technologies, do we need to attack the current capitalist, colonial, patriarchal, ableist status quo? And so now we start with a conversation between Lilith Wittmann and Mia Mingus, curated by Lena, Kollender, and Lorena, Jaume-Palasí, who are also the initiators of this conference. Mia and Lilith will be introduced in a moment. We recorded the conversation before the conference, and afterwards there will be a Q&A here on stage with Lilith Wittmann, and where you can also ask your questions. So, and I don't want to anticipate too much now because the conversation also speaks for itself. So yeah, enjoy.
So, hello, I'm Şeyda, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the conversation Justice, Care, and Technology. Over the next half hour, we will engage in conversation about these topics. We will ask about access to different technologies of care. And finally, what technologies we need to build a movement of liberation from neoliberal, colonial, patriarchal conditions that center able bodies. I would like to begin by introducing the two experts in today's discussion who, in their professional and activist practice, look or work on these issues from quite different perspectives that I'm sure will enrich each other greatly as the conversation progresses. So I start in alphabetical order with Lilith Wittmann, here on the left, on my left. Is a software developer, IT security expert, and activist from Berlin who describes herself as a right influencer. Lilith deals with security research, usually in state infrastructure and data liberation. We will find out what this can mean in the course of the conversation. She gained wider media and attention by, for example, exposing security vulnerabilities. That's a very hard word for me to pronounce. In the German COVID-19 Luca app and the election campaign of the German conservative political party, which filed criminal charges against Lilith. But I think you're kind of used to that, right?
Absolutely. It happens all the time that people are like, yeah, I will sue you for that.
And you're also a member of the Forschung group, which investigates the security of information technology systems, among other things. So welcome, Lilith.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here. And secondly, I'm very happy to introduce Mia. Mia Mingus is a community educator and builder for transformative justice and disability justice. We will also shed some light on these terms in this conversation, hopefully. And in 2020, she founded and leads SOIL, or SOIL, a transformative justice project. She's passionate about building the skills, relationships, and structures that can transform violence, harm, and abuse within communities, and to overcome the punitive system we currently live in. And I'm sure she will also tell herself what she's also passionate about during our conversation. Mia, you have received numerous awards, so many that I can't list them all now. And you also run the blog Leaving Evidence. So welcome, Mia.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Hello. So thank you so much, Lilith and Mia, for taking the time today to share your knowledge and thoughts with us. So let's start talking about technologies of care and access. Mia, I'd like to start the discussion with a term you first mentioned in an essay in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, access intimacy. And at first glance, these two terms come together that I might not usually think of together. So my first question would be, why is it important when we think about care or technology to think about these pair of terms together?
I think it's really important when we think about care and technologies because so first of all, access intimacy is both the way that I've described it in the piece written in 2011, which, by the way, that's so long ago. How is that possible? Is that oftentimes I start with likening it to other forms of intimacy, right? Like emotional intimacy, physical intimacy. And especially with emotional intimacy, that feeling, right? Sometimes you meet somebody and you don't even necessarily have that much of a relationship. Maybe they're a stranger that you just met, but you just feel like they get you, you click. And for whatever reason, you just feel more comfortable with them. You feel more drawn to them. You feel a little bit more safe with them, emotionally safe in this example. And access intimacy is similar in terms of just when somebody gets your access needs, when somebody gets your access, even if they don't know all the particular ins and outs of your access, like the material ins and outs, the logistical ins and outs, but that they understand access and they understand that access is not only just about logistics, that part of what access intimacy does by putting those two terms together is that one acknowledges, right, that access is critical to disabled people's survival, but that two, access has to not only be the logistical and material things, that disabled people are human. And so one, access in and of itself, there is an intimacy to it. Oftentimes it's done badly and that intimacy is not honored. So access is done badly and the intimacy is not honored. So with access intimacy, we're saying that because access is intimate, that there's an intimate quality to it, that we want to actually build that intimacy in its truest form and in a liberatory way into the ways that we do access. And it points to the relationships and the experiences in our lives where we've had that and experienced that, where our humanity as disabled people has been honored as access was happening, or, you know, in the context of access. And so it's a really critical term in my mind that can, of course, the experience can happen between disabled folks and non-disabled people. It can also happen between disabled people and disabled people, other disabled people, even if they don't have your exact same disability.
Oh, thank you so much for your answer. I think it's yeah, opening a wide world of with this term you already mentioned. It's kind of critical term. It's and you also said once in a speech, I guess, without access intimacy, there's survival, but rarely true whole connection. And as I understand it, so please correct me if I'm wrong, it's kind of, I understand it, it's a kind of proactive practice of caring, like it's about the recognition and equal shaping of our interdependence, maybe not only based on material logistic conditions, as I understand you. So this concept, like, or access intimacy, then is not necessarily linked to the infrastructures of an institution or state infrastructure, if that's right. And if it's not only focused on the material conditions of access, and so what does it mean, for example, for in terms of healthcare? So how can we adapt like the concept of access intimacy to the problems, to the questions, for example, of healthcare?
So there's a couple of things in that question. So one is that, yes, access intimacy is not necessarily about systemic kind of community infrastructure in the kind of technical traditional ways we've been understanding it. But I actually feel like in terms of non-technical community infrastructure or non-formal community infrastructure, in the same ways that our relationships are a form of community infrastructure. They just aren't buildings, for example, or roads, but they're a critical part of our infrastructure. And many would argue that they are the infrastructure, that without those, it doesn't matter if you have roads and buildings or schools or what have you. Without relationships, you actually won't have community. And so access intimacy to me is part of the fabric of how we build that community infrastructure and maintain it. Because again, right, part of what access intimacy is saying is that both are needed, that we need to have the infrastructure, kind of traditional infrastructure, material pieces, and we also need to have the relational pieces of access, and that both of those two things are important. And so when I think about how access intimacy can be, you know, utilized someplace like the healthcare system or other systems that might exist, or even institutions, I absolutely think that we can build access intimacy into healthcare. I think the question then to me is not, how does access intimacy happen in healthcare? The question then is, why do we do healthcare in such a way that doesn't cultivate access intimacy, and that actually cultivates the breaking of relationships, that actually cultivates the distrust of each other, more trauma, more disrespect, and that so often disabled people, for example, are not treated as human beings when we go to the doctor, for example, right? Or when we're receiving physical therapy or whatever it may be that we are, you know, seeking the medical industrial complex, as I would say. for. And so to me, this also puts into question healthcare in and of itself and the way that we do it. And that the way that we practice healthcare currently, and I know we're in very different countries, so like I might be speaking, I am speaking about this from a very US context, which we have a terrible healthcare system here. So I do think that part of what, even though we call it healthcare, it's about neither. It's about profit. It's neither about true health or true care. Like health in the kind of deepest sense of the word, not the ableist understanding of what we've been taught it is. So I think that to me would be my question, and that when we think about what health, wellness, healing, whatever these words are that we want to use, whatever term you're using, when we think about what true wellness, true health, true, right, what all of these things, true in their deepest sense means, oftentimes it's understanding interdependence, that you're not an island onto yourself alone. That, I mean, the pandemic is the perfect example of this, right? That the entire world just lived through and is currently living through. And so this idea, right, that to be like health in this context of the pandemic is interdependent, that it's not like Germany can just have a great pandemic response, but the other countries in the world have terrible ones, and then that somehow Germany is going to be healthy. Like we think about wellness, it's not the case that it's on an individualized basis. I mean, yes, that is what the capitalist, ableist, et cetera, white supremacist, et cetera, system has taught us. But we know that that's not true. And climate change is another great example, right? That what health and well-being will means that we have to actually embrace interdependence. And so to me, access intimacy has to be a part of that, because there is no, right, interdependence between all of us, including disabled people. And so we need to practice access intimacy then, because you can't get away from access when you're talking about disability. The access is concrete resistance to the isolation that disabled people face every single day living in an ableist world. And so, and I should also say that access intimacy can exist beyond disability. I mean, I wrote about it in a disabled context, but it can exist around lots of other things, parenting, around gender, around in terms of class and poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all different ways that access intimacy can play out. And so again, we need access intimacy, right? Because we're more than just robots and machines moving through the world. If you identify as a robot or machine, I mean, no offense to you by that. Do you? But I think though that there are many ways that the healthcare system, the school system, et cetera, could try to cultivate access intimacy. And obviously, the best way would be to just fight ableism as much as possible at all terms, and to fight able supremacy.
Thank you so much. You already mentioned the pandemic, which also brings me back to Lilith, who is actually more concerned with as I understand it, with the very logistical issues of access, maybe in the context of digital infrastructures and data. And actually also deal with access to healthcare. And if I understood you correctly in interview, you somehow mentioned that you believe that access to healthcare can be improved through, for example, digitization, also a hard word to pronounce, for example, through health apps. And at the same time, you're part of the security collective Forschung, which discovered critical security vulnerabilities into digital health apps. So my question would be, do you still believe these apps can be reformed and prove equal access to healthcare for different people?
So first of all, I think it really depends on what do you want to achieve with such apps? Because on one side, you could say these apps could be an offer to people who want to have access to a certain tool to support their treatment, for example. I think in those cases, healthcare apps can improve the life of people if they are secure, if they are easily accessible to everyone, and so on and so forth. But what we see in Germany today is not that apps are seen as a tool, as part of therapy, but especially in the public health insurance system with so-called digital health apps, so it's like a program, they see apps as a replacement for therapy with people. And I think as soon as you get into that, fixing like an issue we have in the German healthcare system, like a lack of people that actually want to work in the healthcare system because of all the issues we have there, and try to replace these people with technology, then I think we are going down the wrong path, because I mean, what we then try is to use like mechanisms like economics of scale and standardized therapies, and don't look really into the needs of each and everyone who needs these kind of therapies. And so as they especially try this in the area of psychologist therapies, like I think it's a really, really bad idea of what we are doing there. But I won't say that apps are in general a bad idea to support your health. It's just really dependent on what you want to do. And I think as a supporting tool to track, for example, daily your data inside an app and then share this with your therapist, that can be pretty helpful to some people, but it should be always optional. So you as a patient should decide if you want to do that. It should never replace like actually people inside the healthcare system.
Thank you, which would also bring me kind of back to a more general question, maybe to you. You all already kind of shaped it, but I would like to ask you, what does accessibility mean for you then, Lilith? So how would you describe it?
So, I mean, for me, I mainly work in the area where I somehow interface with the government. So for me, accessibility, for example, means that if somebody has like the legal right to get a certain service from the government, like for example, a housing benefit because they don't earn so much money, then that should be a benefit that should be available to everyone as easy as possible. So people should, in Germany, we have actually this issue of that multiple hundred thousands of people would have access to housing benefits, but they either don't know or it's too complicated for them to actually get them. And so for me, when it comes to government digitalization, for example, accessibility there is also about how to make these kind of resources accessible to everyone. Thinking about concept of a proactive government, because in theory the government has all the data to just send you a wire transfer every month with your housing benefit, but that's not how we design right now government services, for example. And these are just one example, but what I see often is that there are lots of these examples in the more offline, not so digital world. But as soon as we try to transform these concepts into the digital world, often the accessibility of these services gets worse, because then people stop thinking about the government stops thinking about people who maybe don't have access to technologies to request these services, or that they try to standardize the services so much that they just won't work for certain people. So in Germany, we know that there are quite a lot of people living here without an ID card, for example. If you base your entire government service based on that you have an ID card, then this government service won't be accessible for you at all. And it maybe would have been accessible to you in the offline world, because there would be then sitting a person and filing an exception for you. And these kind of exceptions we often lose as soon as we try to start more and more standardized government services and taking humans out of the equation. And that's are the things that I see most often when I think about accessibility in the space I'm working in. And also accessibility in the sense of getting access to data and information from your government that enables you as a community to learn more about the government and our society works, and then try to take actions out of this data. And often accessibility is just up here when we even try to get data and information from the government. So that's also one part of accessibility, in my work.
Thank you so much. I really would like to come back later to what you kind of mentioned, kind of data justice, maybe we can call it, or data liberation. But I would like to first ask Mia, because I'm already talking about I already mentioned the term of justice, and I already mentioned in my introduction that you're very much working on questions of transformative justice. So maybe would you like to kind of tell us, or yeah, kind of shape how transformative justice is linked to maybe access intimacy, or yeah, that's my question firstly, before it's getting too big. Yeah.
Sure. Do you want me to also say what transformative justice is for those who may not know?
Yes, please. Yeah, of course. Thank you.
No problem. So transformative justice is a generative methodology, like a generative approach to harm and violence and within our own communities that, of course, promotes survivor healing, harmer accountability, as well as like community, just general well-being and growth and transformation in ways that don't reinforce current punishment systems out there. And really what we're talking about when we talk about transformative justice is how do we respond to violence, harm, and abuse in a way that helps to both meet the immediate needs of that violence or harm or abuse, but that also, right, can get us closer to the world that we ultimately want. How do we meet the immediate needs in a ways that transforms the conditions that allowed for that act of violence or harm to take place in the first place, right? So that's one. In terms of what TJ is, it's a giant framework, so there's so much more to it. I encourage people who are interested to look into TJ more. A simple Google search will bring you hundreds of articles. But in terms of how it relates to access intimacy, it's so funny talking about technology here because the abbreviation for access intimacy is AI. And so I'm always a little nervous that I'm going to say artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I know the struggle
access
in my notes.
So how it relates to access intimacy, or how TJ relates to access intimacy, I mean, in my mind, there's so many different ways. One, there's the sense of, there's the way that access intimacy, in my mind, is an intervention into a form of harm, in an intervention in, right, it's a way to address and transform ableism, a way to transform the isolation, right, the incredibly isolating conditions that really are the cornerstone of any kind of disability. The isolation plays such a huge part in the ways that ableism manifests in disabled people's lives, as well as many, many other things. So access intimacy being an intervention in and of itself into ableism, able supremacy, and then a number of any other forms of oppression, because disabled people are not only disabled. So what it means for two disabled, people of color, for example, to have access intimacy together is also resisting and an intervention in white supremacy and racism, right? What it means for queer disabled people, and these are just simple examples. Obviously, people have many, many identities, but what it means for queer disabled people, right, is also an intervention in heterosexism and homophobia, for example, right? And if those queer people are also trans and gender nonconforming, then it's an intervention into gender oppression, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one. But I also think that another big place that it connects is in the ways in which we do transformative justice, in the practice of transformative justice. And which is to say that disabled people are one of the many oppressed communities who cannot oftentimes rely on the state or institutions when harm or violence is happening, as most oppressed people cannot. And so with disabled people in particular, though, we have the added layer of even social services are inaccessible. And as Lilith was talking about, right, that even services that might be out there and available to the broader community, they are not accessible to disabled people. So I think when we talk about the way that TJ is practiced, disabled people need to practice TJ as well, and are practicing TJ in many different ways. And so the work, the necessary work to build access intimacy into our practice of transformative justice is also key too. And so there's so many different aspects, right? Because I mean, another way that I think about another place of connection is that violence oftentimes is disabling. I mean, obviously, like if a bullet hits your body or if somebody beats you up physically, but also the emotional and psychological and mental impacts of trauma, of going through traumatic instances and or multiple traumatic instances like abuse, which is consistent violence when the violence becomes a pattern. And so the need for anybody working in any field addressing violence, right? The need for them to understand disability, I think, is critical. I don't understand how we can have conversations about violence, period, at large, without also talking about disability and trauma. Like there's no way in my mind to do that. And that's another example of how ableism, you know, rears its head up out of the sand. Out of the sand? I don't know. Anyways, so I think those are just some of the many examples, but I will stop there.
So thank you so much. I mean, you already mentioned different forms, or the forms of resistance and liberation from ableist, patriarchal, white supremacy, conditions of punishment, etc., etc. And also already mentioned the question of accessibility of social services as a question of justice, which brings me back to Lilith. Maybe you want to deepen this thought, or you have other thoughts on it. How is data liberation, this term we already talked, or I already mentioned in your introduction, linked to these forms of liberation or justice or resistance Mia talked about?
So, I mean, first of all, liberating data from the government enables us to have like numbers and information about where we are currently standing as a society. Data and information we often didn't have before, and data and information who proves like that certain things are happening in our society. For example, like one of the most recent examples I'm working on in Germany till almost today, the company registered. So the place where it's stored, who is owning which company and how much this company is worth, and how much shares this company does have, and who's the beneficial owner, and all these things were not available to the public in like huge amounts. You had to pay per information, point of information per company. And that meant that if you, for example, wanted to figure out who is actually owning all these flats in my city, it's a question. If you won't have access to lots and lots of money, you couldn't answer. And that's a really relevant question, for example, when you start discussions about, well, rent is going up and up and up. What do we want to do about that as a society? Maybe we want to expropriate some of the owners of these flats and want to support the people who are actually living in these flats. But if you want to have a debate about a lot of these things, you need to have like data and information, because that enables you to figure out how big is this issue actually, and what could we do about that. And so I think that by making data accessible to everyone and supporting people in using this data in their social debates, that can enable, first of all, the debate itself, but it can also enable like political change. And I think that's why it's super important, and that's why I myself really often try to then just liberate data, and sometimes crossing a line there and doing illegal stuff, to get these information, because I really also see how that enables people to then have better debates about political decisions.
Thank you very much. I mean, you already talked about the role of the state, which I think it would be really interesting now to talk about, we already talked about transformative justice, so it's not really far to talk about evolution or evolutionist movements. So, but our time is running out now. That's so sad, because I could continue for hours and hours talking with you two, but yeah, so I would like to give you a chance for last statements, words, like you really want to let people know watching this conversation, listening to this conversation during the conference and also online at their homes. So do you still have, something, like in Germany we say, something on your heart to tell us?
Do you want me to go first, Lilith?
Yeah, please.
Unless you had something on your heart. Okay. One thing I wanted to just, I guess the last thing I'll say is, and I forgive me, I can't remember if I already said this before, so if I did, just cut it out maybe, is that, I think that to me, access intimacy is a practice of interdependence. And I think that interdependence is really key in any kind of liberatory change work that we want to do and that we want to have happen. And so to me, interdependence means that we embrace that we rise and fall with each other, and that what you do impacts me and what I do impacts you. And so my push would be, or the last thing I want to say to people is to also urge people just to cultivate interdependence wherever you can and however you can, and to not fall into, oh yes, I'm remembering, I did talk about interdependence a little bit, to not fall into the default position that especially global capitalism, but many other things promote, which that we just only have to focus and worry about ourselves, or I only worry about my family, and if my family's safe, and if my family's healthy, and instead think about how we can take responsibility, and that we are all connected to each other, and that we can take responsibility for, the group, the family, the community, whatever it is, the school or your job that you work at, like that we are all players who can help to shape what the future looks like, and help to shape how those groups, how those entities look and operate, and to not there's something in here that's also like to not just relinquish ourselves and just kind of surrender to the idea that we're powerless, and that oh well, the planet's gonna burn anyway, so there's no use in me doing anything, or oh well, violence is inevitable, so I'm not going to do anything. And it's just like, if we all thought that, we would be in a very terrible place. And luckily, there are so many freedom fighters around the globe who don't think that way, and that we all want you to join us if you're not already one of those folks.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Lilith.
Yeah, I mean, even though we are coming from two totally different things, in the end, it's pretty cool to see that we are both coming from different worlds, but going into the same direction in a certain way. And I also want to encourage everybody that it's never too late to stand up and try to change something. And I mean, it can be liberating data, but it can be also doing much cooler stuff like Mia does. So and thank you so much for the conversation.
Yeah. Liberating data is cool, yeah. It was the last. There's already Lilith coming on stage. Hey, yeah, come in. Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. And I mean, as you may already have noticed, like the recording just stopped there. We recorded this conversation like 3 or 4 days ago, and of course, I thanked our experts in our conversation online. Now I want to thank you again. And yeah, should we take a seat over there for Q&A? So, yeah. So in our conversation with Mia, we stopped kind of at questions of data liberation, transformative justice, the role of the state, which is quite contradictory. So we talked about how the states maybe has to provide social access to social services for all and the logistical framework, but also in the same time enforces repressive, discriminatory practices that are sometimes based on standardizing needs and dependencies. For example, always make the access needs of disabled people the exception, and also by denying access to services and to data. But I'd like to take another step back and ask again for your expertise, which also relates to this status quo here in Germany. In which areas of government responsibility do you see an increasing use of digital technologies? What are they being programmed for? And yeah, what do you think of that?
So I think, first of all, we see digitalization currently in almost, or people trying to digitize stuff. I don't want to say that there is actually digitalization happening, but trying to digitize stuff happens in almost all areas right now. I mean, from digital identity, so basically the government providing us digital documents to identify ourselves against other parties, to the digital health system, to automating processes in our bureaucracy. So basically in all areas. And what I also see is that in all these areas, usually we are not really thinking about the people first, but we are thinking about the processes first. So we think about, we have now this process in our democracy, and from like top level, it looks like these processes are working, but I mean, often these processes are working because the people who are executing them have like have like limits on how to execute them, but have also quite a bit of freedom. And when we now start digitizing processes that we wrote into law like 50 years ago and try to fully automate them, then this sometimes comes to certain limits, because then if a machine decides, this machine might decide absolutely according to law. So basically the basic idea on how our bureaucracy was designed like many years ago, but not the way we executed over the last 50, 70 years, because there was always a bit of freedom. And I mean, we see that now in really many areas. I mean, I look a lot into the digital health system we currently seeing being built up in Germany, so that people don't have now, or soon won't have, the full freedom anymore on what kind of information they want to share with different doctors, for example, because I mean, technically, it's the digital health record system is implemented in a way that people could remove information out of that they don't want to share with all their doctors. But in practice, this technology will be so complicated for most people that they won't be able to do that. And so that's like maybe one really concrete example. But in general, we see that in all kinds of different government processes, that people are more and more who administrate these processes from the government side, losing like their freedom by applying more and more technology into the processes.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I just we just open the Q&A also for the audience. Are there any questions at this moment? So yeah, I think over there. Yeah, there is Lena going around with a microphone. Thank you.
Just a basic question. in countries like Australia, they have a health system where you are in the health system. You have to make a decision not to be in the health system. Is that a general trend?
So in Germany, I mean, in the public health system, the digital health records, they are also opt-out now. So basically that means by default, the digital health records will be turned on, and I mean, there will be a certain freedom on if you can, like, if your doctor will store documents in there or not. But in the end, for most patients, they won't be able to take like an informed decision on that.
Thank you. I mean, if you feeling better and asking your question in German, for example, we can also try to translate then your questions. So don't be shy. Just over there. Sorry. Yeah.
That's all right. I have a question concerning how you liberate data, because you said in the recording, for example, who owns what flats or houses in your city. I was wondering if you have a platform or something you'd recommend to find data regarding the budget that social services or welfare officers have regarding, for example, dishing out something that is in Germany is called personal budget for people who are ascribed to have disabilities. Yeah, I'm not sure if you know people or you yourself are doing research on this and where this data might be published or not.
Sadly, I didn't do any research on this specific topic. So in general, I think this should be federal data. We have now the so-called Datennutzungsgesetz in Germany, which is a law that allows you to ask like the office that is responsible for this data that they provide it to you, because they should have this as a data set, and then they need to give that to you, usually for free, or at maximum of 200 euros or something. But yeah, so I mean, but in practice, it's often still hard actually getting this data, because then there are like lots of reasons they can give you why they won't give it to you, because they say it's maybe research data, or it's data that has like personal attributes in a certain, I mean, maybe not in this data set, but in general, it's like kind of hard for getting actually data via the Data Freedom Act.
There, the next question is coming. Yeah.
Hello, Lilith. Maybe more like a broader question. Let's have a look at the future, because it's about shaping future would be nice. So in an ideal context or scenario, what would be a way you would have something like a transformative force within communities and even the state to have a situation where data is used but not abused, and which kind of mechanisms maybe Germany has, even as a maybe positive example, how data protection is used or not used? Getting the point? So what would be your ideal scenario if we all would thrive in that direction, or in any direction?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I think that all data that is not directly related to people, and of which there are not like high risks of providing it to everyone, that should be always provided to everyone for free. And I mean, that's something we are far away from today. So today it's like more like the default, for, especially when it comes to government's data, that it's just not public, or that it's that even the government still tries to sell some data sets to their citizens, what I think is like a total anti-pattern. And I mean, when it comes then to data that also has like personal data in it, of which certain kinds of data set should be available to the public. So for example, I think like the ownership register of who owns a company should be like in the public, because that's like information that provides more to the public good than it actually hurts. I mean, but still, to each and every of these big data sets, we need to have like a debate in our society, first of all, on what are the risks of this data, because today we don't talk about
the data we want to release before we actually are doing it. And I think that's something we need to do, and there needs to be processes for that, on how to do that and how to actually involve the people that are part of these data sets into the discussion, and make sure that there is no bigger harm we do to our society. On how to design such processes, I'm still not 100% sure how to do that, but we need to start this discussion, and because we don't do it today, today it's usually if any kind of data gets like free access from one day to the other, how it now happened kind of to the company register. Yeah, there is just no debate, it just happens, and nobody talks about what could be potential risks or not.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience? Yeah, here in the first, second row again. Microphone is coming, yeah.
Is it a correct description that you're giving data a nationality? We're saying German data. Can't it be, you know, American multi-corporate, you know, insurance companies taking the same trip or the same information, or Chinese companies or Japanese or Russian? Is it, it's just data that everybody can have a go at trying to get it?
Oh, yeah, I didn't want to give data a nationality, especially, yeah, no, definitely not. But I mean, I talked about data that should be provided by the German government, because I mean, usually I work in the context of the German government and data they provide or they should provide. But you're right that open data should be open to everyone and not like bound to nationalities or anything. Open data means like really open to everyone, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes left. If there are more questions from the audience, now is the time. Or while you are thinking about your questions, maybe I was wondering if there have been recently in the last years or months, you said there is no debate, but I mean, there have to be like people like you or groups or other movements who are like challenging the status quo. So are there any examples in the recent months, years where you say, okay, there something really good happened, so people are really good fighting?
So I mean, one example I still really like is that we stopped like the approach from the German government on how to do digital identities. By hacking their digital identity platform, and it was like up and running for 7 days or something. Then we proved that this entire concept and how they wanted to do digital identities based on blockchain was like totally broken, and then it got shut down, and now the project is cancelled as far as I know. I mean, there will be new approaches on how to do that, but yeah, the approach they did was the so-called ID wallet, so wallet-based identity management system, that has been stopped based on that we could prove that the concept they wanted to implement was totally broken. And I mean, it's still pretty sad that we as like civic tech activists need to come and need to show everyone that the concept the government has been working on for multiple years is like flawed, and nobody maybe asked us before or listened to our concerns or anything. But I mean, the cool thing is that these mechanisms of actually proving people pretty fast that it's broken, that this brings us to the point that they stop it as a government, is also kind of positive. And I mean, then afterwards, they also talk to us and ask us what we would do. And I mean, right now, actually, about the topic of digital identities, I have like, I mean, still informal, and I think that's one of the issues. I have like lots of talks with politicians and government institutions on how to do that actually better. But I mean, we are still lacking like formal processes on how to do like a debate as the entire society about these topics.
Yeah, totally. So last chance for a question. No. Okay, yeah. Go. If there there, over there? No, nothing. Okay.
Just a very short question. Lilith, can you give a quick comment on the system that's happening in China now? Are they getting it? You know, they're probably getting it wrong, but they're probably the upside and downside.
So you mean a social credit? You are going in the direction of social credit systems. So to be honest, I can't talk much about what is actually happening in China because I mean there's like lots of bias in what we see in especially European media, but I think almost everywhere outside China about these systems. So it's really hard to give any comment on what's actually happening there right now. I think when it's about centralization of data and controlling like people's behavior based on data and based on technology, then it's always something bad, no matter if it happens in China or if it happens in Europe or anywhere else in the world. So yeah, I think the European idea of a social credit system, how we see it in the media, is like pretty bad, but I'm not sure if the European idea of a social credit system we see in the media is actually the reality, because I mean that's always with a bit of bias. So
yeah, thank you. Okay. So I think our session ends in a minute. So is there anything you want to add to things we already discussed, or a question you want to?
I mean,
to the audience.
I mean, I always think about how these processes to involve like lots of people into like complex decisions, especially about data liberation and also about like how technologies that we will build in the future will change our society, how we can formalize processes about social debates about these topics. So that's something I'm super interested if people have like more ideas about that, because I'm also lacking ideas.
Great. So thank you very much, Lilith,
Thank you
for the conversation and for the Q&A, for joining us today. So big applause for Lilith.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was really mind-blowing talking to you and listening to the things you told us. So we will continue at 1 p.m. here with the panel Blackness, African Indigeneity and Computation, curated and moderated by Khadija Abdurrahman. So then did I forget anything so far? No, then see you later in an hour already. And enjoy the break. Thank you.